My friend, this is Joe Bakhmutsky. Welcome to this podcast where we talk about healing from trauma. And today I'm super excited to be talking to Sean Cuthbert, clinical psychologist who specializes in PTSD, healing from trauma, is also an expert on internal family systems, which is evidence-based type of therapy that can really help us in healing from trauma. But it's also like a unique way of seeing yourself and your internal world. And today we're going to really dive in and find out what it is, like how it works, and why it might be helpful in us leading a happier and more fulfilled life. And Sean, in this space of healing from trauma, it's vital to not only have a brilliant mind, which I'm sure you have, but also a huge heart, which I know you have. So I'm just honored to have you on this podcast. Sean, thank you for being here and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. It's a unexpected honor and privilege.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. I want to start first to ask you about your definition of trauma, given that everything that you have seen, everything that you know, everything that you've experienced today in working with it, how would you define trauma today?
Yeah. Something I probably go back to a bit is I heard this definition from Dr. Gabor Mate, who's I'm sure you know who he is, as a he's a GP who worked, or a medical doctor who worked for a long time in the poorer areas of, I think it was in Vancouver. He worked with the people with quite extreme drug addiction for multiple decades, and now he writes books, and he has his own therapeutic approach, which is called compassionate inquiry. And he says, which I really like, is that trauma isn't just the thing that happens to us. It's actually the thing or the process that happens inside of us, but probably most importantly, in the absence of like a compassionate witness to our experience. And I think probably and I think a lot of probably trauma therapy is moving in this direction. Like, and what IFS, internal family systems, does is it actually either excavates or helps the client find that compassionate witness to their experience. But in most probably traditional therapies, the therapist would be that compassionate witness to their experience. But what happens in IFS is we actually find that inside the client in what IFS calls the self. So they actually get to be their own compassionate witness to the experience of the parts of them that have been stuck in traumatic events or experienced traumatic events. So that's probably how I see it. That's probably the definition that resonates with me.
Yeah, that's so powerful, Sean, because so many times we experience this trauma alone and we end up feeling alone, which is incredibly hurtful. So, speaking about IFS, how did it become a part of your life?
That's like most things, it's not a linear answer. So I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, so I went through my master's training, and I can't remember there being probably too much said about trauma. Like there was never like wasn't spoken about to any significant degree. I think people probably casually referenced it a few times, but I don't remember any significant training about it. And then my first job out of university, I worked at an agency that dealt with young people with coexisting drug problems and mental health problems. But what I actually got was people with drug problems and these just horrific histories of trauma, like just the worst possible circumstances. that they'd survived. And I was very fortunate that at that time, the person who was the senior therapist in the organisation, put a lot of effort into getting us all a lot of really good professional development around trauma. And we were all shipped off to a training where we saw Janina Fisher, who is a very well-known trauma therapist. She's her primary modality is a body-based trauma therapy called sensory motor psychotherapy. And do you know who she is? Have you ever heard of her?
I've got a book by her, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay, all right, you should read it. Is it the healing the parts of the traumatized self or something like that? I can't remember the title of it.
I think it's in the other room.
Yeah, it's the book is like, the book's really good, but I remember seeing her, and it's probably the first time I've ever like kind of gone, now I kind of get it. And I remember at the end of it was 2 or 3 days of just listening to Janina Fisher talk. And there was probably like 500 people there, and I probably wasn't quite aware of like how influential she was in the trauma world. She got like a 10-minute standing ovation. It's like she was a rock star. And this is like a 70-year-old woman who'd been a trauma therapist for decades, but she really had like a spark about her that really resonated with me. And after that, I went and learned. So then I kind of went off on my little journey to learn various approaches that really focused on treating trauma. So the first one I landed at was EMDR, which I know you've probably experienced a little bit of EMDR in your healing journey. So that was the first one I landed at. And I think around that time, that was probably around the time Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score came out. And so these approaches, which were probably not that well known, suddenly became really well known. So I probably did EMDR for a year or two, and I thought EMDR was the answer. But like anything, you learn that it has its limitations and its problems. And then after EMDR, I went off and actually learned sensory motor psychotherapy, the modality that Janina Fisher is well known for. And then I think I'd already had some sense that internal family systems was in this kind of group of modalities that were in The Body Keeps the Score and were known to be like effective in the treatment of trauma. But I remember reading about it and just thinking, this is just weird. Like all this talk about the self and groups of parts like managers and firefighters and exiles and the whole process you go through to reprocess the trauma. I just thought, no one's gonna like buy this if I start doing this with them. This just sounds really, really strange. Anyway, so I completely dismissed it, and because I have skeptical parts, and which have probably served me pretty well over time. And then I remember I was talking to like another psychologist who I knew and respected, and she had mentioned that IFS was like really like a thing that people should learn. And I was like, all right, if this person is saying it's something, I should probably listen to her. And that was probably around the time that, because before like 2017, 2018, there was no official IFS trainings in Australia, so they just didn't exist. You had to go to America to actually get trained, because they were all in person then. So there were probably, I don't know, at that point there was probably like 10 people in Australia who were actually trained in IFS, and so nobody really knew about it. It was still this kind of underground thing. And I tried to get into the first training that was held in Australia in 2018. I think I just missed out. So I got into the second one, and I turned up, and I'd paid a a lot of money to do this 14-day thing. And I showed up, and there's already a lot of people there who were converts, like really had swallowed the Kool-Aid. And I was still in my skeptical parts, and I was just like, God, all these people are really, they're all really crazy. This is really weird. And anyway, I remember I sidled up to someone on the first day, and I was like, God, this all just seems like bullshit to me. And so I was really blended with my skeptical parts. And then I think on day 2, when you start to actually, because most of the training is either being the therapist or being the client and having the therapy. And I remember having the experience of having the therapy, and it was just the most like profound thing that I've ever experienced, just in terms of, therapies. And I've, trained in a few. So I've had a bunch of these things, experienced them firsthand, and it just blew me away. I was just like, this is incredible. Like the fact that there's all this stuff inside of you that, very few other therapies actually get close to even touching into. So I had my own experience of it, and so I was completely sold. And then I did level 1, and then I went on, and so level 1 is like 14 days, level 2 was like 10 days. I did level 3 during the pandemic. So like I've done all the training. It's just, I just think it's like the best thing ever. That's a very long answer to what you asked, but that's it's quite a journey.
Yeah, and it was quite a journey from thinking this is crazy to go into a place where you go, this is the best thing ever. I love hearing that, Sean. That's especially because that's mirrors, the journeys we go through in life, right? Where we learn about what's right for you. So tell me about the internal family systems like model. Like how does it work in a nutshell? Like how does it all fit in?
Yeah. Well, it's a bit like I often liken it to like talking about swimming before you get in the water, which is why it's hard to actually like talk about it. But I'll do my best at giving you like a rough overview. So I suppose in IFS, what we'd, a lot of people would, because it's like a parts model. So and there's a few psychotherapies that are parts models like ego state therapy, which I know you know about, schema therapy to a lesser degree. I think there's an older style parts model called transactional analysis. So like these are all parts-based models. So I mean, the model's created by Dr. Richard Schwartz, who's a psychologist, family therapist in America. I think he lives in Boston. And what happened was he was trained as an external family therapist working with external families, but then he decided to experiment with, I think he originally was working with clients with young people with quite extreme eating disorders, and he started to just listen to their language about what was happening inside of them. And so the model is just developed, unlike other models, which are, developed through a lot of research and questionnaires and drilling down of concepts. The model was just developed from him, and then this cohort of therapists that he gathered around him, just listening to their clients and listening how their internal worlds are constructed. And turns out like the way that those clients' internal worlds are constructed can actually be applied to basically everyone. So there's 3 categories of parts that we try and get in contact with in IFS. There's we differentiate between protective parts, which are parts that we kind of live in from our day-to-day lives, which are called managers, which are proactive parts that kind of run our lives. Like your manager part made sure that you were probably in this Zoom room on time, Joe. my managers weren't as diligent because I was 10 minutes late. Um, so those are protective parts that, help us get out of bed at the right time of, when we need to in the morning, be at work on time, fulfill our responsibilities, pay our bills and mortgages on time, do the admin of life. So, they're very proactive in making sure that all that is in place. And then the other category of protective parts are called firefighters, which are more reactive parts. So if we think about firefighters in terms of things that come in when some distress or pain has been excavated, like, drug and alcohol use is probably a key firefighter behavior. Screens are a big one for everyone, looking at their phone, binge watching Netflix, all that stuff.
Never done any of it.
Yeah, I know. It's completely alien to me as well. Uh, trying to think of some other firefighters. Gambling's another one. Eating is a big one for people. Like people talk about comfort food or whatever. That's a firefighter that's trying to give comfort to the system that's in a little bit of distress. So they're protective parts that generally come up for people. And beneath that kind of top layer of parts is what we call exiles, which are essentially parts of, often quite young parts of people's systems that are holding the traumas of the stuff that happened to them in childhood. So, attachment wounds, abuse, neglect of various sorts. And probably the thing that differentiates IFS from other parts models is this concept of the self, that at the core of all of us, we have this self, which is characterized by what in IFS we call the 8Cs, which are C words that I'll talk about in a minute. But like this self is in everyone, like even in the most, traumatized system, this self still exists. It's just sometimes covered up by more protective parts, and it takes a bit longer to find it. And so what the therapy essentially is it's a relationship building exercise between the self of the person and these parts. And what we're always trying to do is bring these things, the crux of the therapy is building the self to part relationship, like really, elevating the self to be the leader of the system rather than some of these parts that have probably been thrust into extreme roles by the traumas that happen to the child parts. So the whole thing is about relationships, internal relationships. And, what happens, and this is the practical step, what happens in the external world when you really bring the internal system back into harmony is that people's external relationships have to change. You can't change one part of a system without other parts of the system being kind of impacted. So people's external relationships just get a bunch easier when their internal world is actually more settled.
And it makes so much sense, Sean, because that it's all about relationships and it's about finding ways to live with yourself, I guess. And I really love this idea of the self that is always protected and pure, and that can bring other parts into play. But how do you even know what sort of parts exist inside of you? How do you find out about that?
Well, you might be aware there's a book that Richard Schwartz has written, which has been quite popular, which is called No Bad Parts, weirdly enough. So basically, have you read that at all? Yeah, good. So all parts, we're really probably unlike some therapies, like all parts are welcome into the therapeutic space. Like some parts don't get demonized and pathologized. Like anything that shows up is welcome. It's only really when a part has stepped into an extreme role in the person's life that and it's probably pretty obvious to them and to even when they're just in the initial conversation with me, what parts are actually probably like most prominent for them. So a common one, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, is like an inner critic. You might have one of them, Joe.
No.
So like an inner critic will show up as, like, I'm just thinking about how this stuff usually shows up for people. Someone will come in and they're critical of like a behavior that they're doing, or essentially what's happening is a critic will show up would have dragged the person to therapy, and they would be critical of another part of them, which is often like a part that's depressed, or a part that's super anxious, or a part that's using a substance, or a part that's eating too much. And you'll ask the person, for example, I'd say, how do you feel towards the part of you that's drinking too much? And they'll say, oh, I fucking hate it. And I'll be like, oh, okay, so you've got another part, you've got a critical part that's actually critical of this drinking part. And then I'll be like, well, is it critical of anything else? And then it'll reel off 5 other parts that it hates in there as well. So, the thing that's potentially brought the person to therapy is maybe the drinking, but ultimately that isn't really the problem. The problem is the part that's so critical of the drinking, because it thinks that being critical of the drinking will somehow shift that behavior, but all it really does is it usually sends the behavior underground, and then it pops up when the critic isn't watching, or the critic's preoccupied, or the circumstances call for the drinking to become prominent, like in a social situation. So like then you would know that there's at least 2 parts to work with there. There's the critical part that hates the drinking and probably a bunch of other things the person is doing, but also there's a part that uses alcohol to manage probably more vulnerable feelings. So these things are just evident when you're just talking to people, and as a therapist, my job is kind of to be this what we call an IFS, like a parts detector, to actually just listen carefully to what they're saying, just to pick the parts out, and then hopefully over time the client themselves can be their own parts detector to notice what parts are active in whatever situation they're in. But that gives us a place to start in terms of what parts to kind of target to work with, and in this situation we probably either start with the critic, we might start with the drinking part, depending on how problematic it is in terms of the person's functioning. So that's usually where we start.
It's fascinating, Sean, how you talk about parts that have been pulled into doing these more critical tasks that are outside of what they're supposed to be doing.
Yep.
And from what I'm hearing you say is, you want to try to bring them more aligned to their original purpose, or whatever, work out the original job description, whatever that might be. So how does that work? Is that some kind of a negotiation process?
Yeah.
How do you resolve this?
There is a little bit of negotiation in there. So oftentimes, and some of this is going to sound a bit conceptually weird, but it makes perfect sense to people when they go inside and do work with the parts. Oftentimes you will introduce let's say the critic, for example. Oftentimes you'll introduce the critic to the person's self. You'll be like, oh, ask the critic if it knows who you are. And the client will ask the critic, and the critic will be like, nah, no idea. So it has no idea that there is actually a self in there who can actually listen and support the critical part. And then, we do this process, which we call updating, where essentially we show the critical part, who, how old the person is, like all the internal and external resources that they have access to, show them around their life to see, actually see how good things are. And oftentimes, like in this case, like the critic would be stunned. It's just like, it is shocked, because it still thinks you're 5 living in your parents' house, wherever it learned to actually criticize you from. So it's actually stunned that it's decades later and um, you're now an adult who can actually handle things without needing to go into its extreme critical role.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the idea of it's, you know, you learn essentially about yourself, and there's an element of leadership, right? I think it's the
Yeah.
self leadership part,
Yeah,
right?
we talk about self-leadership in IFS, which is this idea that the self can actually be the one that like listens to everyone in there rather than these, you know, um, in this case, the critic, like having the loudest voice. And often, in this process of updating, you'll ask the critic how it feels about being so critical of the person's other parts. And the critic will be like, oh, I hate it. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. This sucks. Because, all it's doing is standing in there just yelling at a bunch of other parts, which is, think about how that would be just as an external person if you just stood on a street corner just screaming at people all the time. It'd be exhausting. So to actually listen to what it's like for the critic to do its thing, and it'll tell you it's tired of it. I reckon 99 times out of 100, it'll say some version of, I'm sick of it, I'm tired of it, I don't want to do it anymore. And then you can actually start to invite it into like another role or give it some other options. Like most critics want to, when you get down to it, they actually want to just support the person in a way that isn't like so onerous and energy sapping. Like they really just want to be like a cheerleader for the person. But they've never actually, like, either that's never been role modeled appropriately in their external life. They've never actually had the opportunity to do that. And sometimes that takes a bit of repetition. But ultimately, I don't think I've ever met a critic that wanted to keep criticizing the person in the way that that there probably has been as it's moved into its extreme role. And I've worked in a bunch of systems, Joe. So this stuff is pretty universal.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so, what are some of the common transitions from parts that have been pulled into these extreme roles? I know you just mentioned obviously the inner critic. What are some of the other ones that are where they, I think you used the word, upgrade or update into, or transfer into, I guess, a different part of yourself, doing something that is hopefully helpful and supportive.
Yeah. Well, it's very, I suppose the difference between this and maybe other models is like it's very unique to the person. Like we'll always, like, we ask the part what he wants to do, and it'll tell us. Like if people get really good at listening, so so these ideas don't come from us. Like all we do, like all the therapist does is guide the person to their own answers. I mean, a lot of times parts will just say, like, particularly these protective parts, they just say, oh, I just want to like have a rest. And they'll wander off to the side and just lay down and just let the client just deal with whatever the parts that it's been protecting, like younger parts that are holding the trauma. So sometimes they don't actually want to do anything. Like sometimes they just want to go and pull up a hammock and just and just lay down. Other times they'll move into, like, much like I just gave that example with the critic, I can think of someone who had a part that was like a people pleaser, like really like managed external people by being very, friendly and lovely and all that stuff, but from a parts-led place rather than a self-led place. And that person invited the part into a different role, and I think actually it instead of looking outwards to please people, it actually turned towards the person and just wanted to please the self. So that's a weird, very specific example. I mean, that was a whole thing that went on with that, but like these things, like they're really specific to the client, and all we do is just invite the client to listen to the part, and the part always like It always knows what it wants. So we just listen to it. So it
Love
can be
the
anything.
love it. I love the idea also that we kind of have all the answers
Yeah.
inside of us already. It's kind of
Yeah.
a matter of bringing them out.
Yeah.
Uh, that's super
I mean,
powerful.
it's really in many ways, like a large part of the skill set of the IFS therapist is actually trusting the client. Because I suppose, harking back to my clinical training, I wasn't taught to trust the client. I was taught to see people as like broken and dysfunctional, or their behavior as pathological. I wasn't actually taught to trust people. That's just something that I've been fortunate enough to learn through all these therapies that I've studied over time.
Wow, that's yeah, that seems like a totally different approach
It is.
to working with
Imagine
people.
if we just walked around trusting each other all day, Joe.
No, can't do that. Well, yeah, we'll totally would be living in a completely different world, Sean.
Yeah, no, we would. Yeah.
And speaking of that, like this is what makes me think about internally family systems. And I think it's such a, you know, compassionate, but also kind of humane part of being kind to yourself, because it kind of takes off the pressure of being just one way. I'm just this one thing, and
Yeah.
here's how I am. But there's kind of different sides of you, and I think that's feels right to me because it kind of takes off the pressure and allows to explore more. So, do you think, Sean, that we could take this idea of internal family systems kind of beyond therapy
Mm.
and into our daily life? Like how
Oh
is
yeah, well, I
that
mean,
work?
without a doubt. I mean, I think um the vision of the IFS Institute, which I don't work for, but I certainly am associated with it just through being a certified IFS therapist and IFS consultant, is to actually take this model outside the therapy room. Because I certainly don't think of it as just a therapeutic modality. I mean, I think of it as more of a way to not only understand myself, but understand everyone else. And that certainly, and I know for clients, when they can do that, take it outside of just their own experience and actually start to see extreme parts of other people. Like people become less, like external people become less kind of unpredictable. Like everything else just becomes a bit clearer. Like this person acted this way at work, you know, like they were in an extreme manager role because they're obviously protecting something that is probably a bit more vulnerable inside of them. So you actually just can see other people a bit clearer, and also that allows people to be a bit more compassionate to external people's experience, which then allows you to stay, somewhat connected to them despite whatever, extreme thing they're doing around you or in front of you, or you can, choose to leave if it doesn't feel safe for you. But like, it just allows you to understand that, like, the world's not everyone's not a mystery. People aren't mysteries. I mean, there are mysteries, but like in some ways, people are highly predictable.
Exactly, and that's what I guess healing is all about, isn't it? That we come to accept not only ourselves,
Mm.
but also accept the world around us and
Mm.
where we're going.
Yeah.
I'd
I
love
mean, it's
to.
certainly, for me, I mean, I know that it's certainly changed, a lot of my external relationships with people. I remember after I did level one and I came back and I was back in the workplace, and someone who I had an okay relationship with, but wasn't super close with, came up to me and said, "What's happened? What's going on?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" She said, "You're entirely different." She said, "You're much softer than you used to be." And I was like, I just laughed because we had a conversation, which is probably the most connected conversation me and this other person had ever had. And it was, I told her about what I'd been doing and everything, and she said, "Whatever this is, this seems pretty good."
Keep doing it.
So it's interesting that you get that feedback from someone who didn't even know where I'd gone and what I'd done, but they clearly noticed that something had shifted.
Yeah, that's fascinating because it means that you've changed quite significantly, Sean.
Yeah, definitely.
Wow. I just love this idea of internal landscape. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Sean. And listen, if somebody wanted to find out more about what you do or maybe working with you, what would they do?
They can just go to my website, which is seancuthbert.com.au. I'm pretty busy, so I'm not encouraging people to contact me for therapy necessarily, but I mean, if people want to contact me, I can always, and I don't have space, I can always put them on to other IFS therapists. There's probably been, I reckon there's been 8 or 9 level 1 trainings in Australia in the last 5 years, so they don't happen that routinely. So there's probably, I don't know, 250 to 300 IFS trained therapists in Australia now, which doesn't seem that much because everyone's really busy. Like, it's very rare that you hear someone who is trained in IFS is not actually struggling to keep up with the demand, just because like people often come to me from like, you know, probably more traditional therapies that have kind of scratched the surface but haven't gone as deep as they want to. If people go to the IFS Institute website, which is the American website, and there's a find a therapist or find a practitioner tab that they can click on and drop down box Australia, and there's 40 to 50 therapists of various levels of training listed there. Like, that's another option for people to find a therapist. They can do a Google. I'll probably come up first, but there'll be a bunch of other people who you know have websites. I mean, the therapy is really exploded in popularity in the last 5 years, and you can't even, like, people are waiting years to get into these trainings now. It's ridiculous. Like, they don't even work on a waitlist system. They work on a lottery system. So you essentially have to go into a lottery now to get into these trainings, which, I mean, it makes me grateful that I was on the front foot with signing up. But like, I supervise a bunch of psychologists who want to get into the training but can't, just because like they're oversubscribed, not only in Australia but worldwide, and the institute's really been kind of caught on the hop because like they were just chugging along, just doing their trainings, and suddenly everyone wanted to get trained in this thing. Super popular. But therapy, like I said to you when we had a chat initially, evidence-based, really, really effective, goes into really deep stuff about yourself you kind of had a sense of, and some of you didn't even know, and it's just really gentle and beautiful.
Awesome. Sean, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time. And also just thank you for what you do in the world.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Joe. And thanks for what you're doing. This podcast is really helpful to people.